The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
You're listening to Coffee and Comics, part of the Secrets of Movies and TV Shows podcast, where we talk about the hidden meanings and deeper layers of superhero movies and the great comic book stories that they adapt. And today we'll be discussing Sony and Marvel's latest animated multiverse extravaganza, Spider-Man: Across the Spider-Verse. I'm your host, Thomas Salerno, and I'm joined today by Patrick Mason. Hello, Pat.
Howdy, Tom.
And by Andrew Hermiz. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, glad to be here.
And by special guest Mike Schramm of the Voyage Comics Podcast. Hi there, Mike.
Saving the best for last, right?
Absolutely, yeah. You are the guest. I must save you for last. But yeah, be sure to follow the podcast, guys, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast app and directory of choice. And you can find us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, and on Twitter, where we are at SQPN, or on Instagram, where we are at StarQuest Network. And please do us all a favor by sharing the podcast with your friends or any comic book geeks out there who you know, because we're going to have a lot of great discussions in the future. But I'm really excited to talk about Across the Spider-Verse, especially because this is kind of a crossover episode. As I mentioned earlier, we're joined on the panel by special guest Mike Schramm, who's one of the co-hosts of the Voyage Comics Podcast. Voyage Comics is an independent Catholic comic book company. I've actually had the privilege to help story edit and brainstorm a couple of their comic book issues. And I've actually been a regular contributor to the blog for, about 3.5 years now. That's pretty insane. And Mike, I know you because you currently edit the blog. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, the Voyage Comics show, and why you wanted to join us for our discussion of Across the Spider-Verse?
Yeah, how many posts do I need to put on now that you're having me on the show, Thomas? How many is this going to be worth? How many do I have? Anyway, sorry. So I've been helping with creating the Voyage podcast with one of my friends, Jacob Claddy, and we've been doing that for, I guess it'd be about 6 months now, or they've been releasing for about 6 months, but we've been kind of putting it together really the past year. Mike Lavoie approached me and talked to me, and we knew each other beforehand, and we've had a lot of good conversations about these sorts of things, whether it's the first Spider-Verse movie or just any of the works of fantasy literature, comics, superhero movies, things like that. And just because of my background I teach theology at a Catholic school, both the high school and college in the area that I live in, and so I'm always kind of thinking about these things through that lens. Fortunately, I get to do a lot of that stuff in my work where I actually have one of my students they'll have to take some work of contemporary, I call it the contemporary or modern fairy tale. They'll take one of the Disney movies and they have to find some sort of theological angle to write it from. And so it kind of helps them kind of see the world through that lens. So I've already been thinking along these lines for so long. And so getting to kind of have those conversations has been really fun. And then same thing with the blog. I mean, the blog's been around long before I started, my work with editing it. But it's doing a lot of those same things. And so getting to kind of immerse myself in that world a little bit more I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, no,
and that really jives with what we do here at SQPN of just talking about a lot of these fantasy and sci-fi and superhero shows, that Catholic angle, and looking for the deeper layers. Because, I encounter people all the time who are just like, superhero movies are so superficial and yada, yada, yada. But no, I think they really are the modern myths. And so I think that, especially with Spider-Man, he's such iconic is an overused word, but he's a very archetypical kind of mythic character.
My co-host, Jacob, who is Eastern Orthodox, he would love that you're referring to it as iconic. So.
Oh, well, yeah, and you know what? My brother is actually attends a Byzantine Catholic church, and we have icons around our house. So yeah, I'm trying to get used to using that term in the more Catholic and Orthodox sense of the icons.
You know, I was thinking about what you were saying before about people not taking superhero movies seriously. And I was thinking, were there people in ancient Greece who were walking around like, oh, Hercules, that's just a story. Why are you thinking so deep about it?
No, there were, because I've read some of the Greco-Roman philosophers where they say that. They're like, oh, those myths, never mind. Like, don't even pay attention to them. And I'm like, oh.
So it's always been there.
I think that strain has kind of always been there in culture. But yeah, no, and speaking of like, you know, myths of epic scale, like this movie definitely is. And I want to go around the panel and get your guys' initial thoughts about this movie. Andrew, how about you? What was your initial thoughts of Across the Spider-Verse?
Wow, it was spellbinding. I think that's a good word. I was really visually stunned by it. I mean, the first one was definitely an experience. I considered the first one like the best animated feature film I've ever seen. And after watching this one, I came out of it like they somehow topped the first one, in my opinion. You know, I was obviously expecting another visual spectacle and great animation and all that, but they somehow like they did something better. I felt like they obviously achieved the sort of animation heights that they did with the first film and found like new ways and sort of new techniques and whatever. I mean, I don't know how they did it. I know like hundreds and thousands of animators work on this. So it's you can see that full work on display. And so watching the film in IMAX was really like one of the best cinematic experiences I can remember. You know, it'll definitely stand out. I mean, I think since like maybe watching Endgame in the theaters, it was, and on top of all that, I mean, it's a great story. It handles the multiverse, I think, better than any comic book movie we've seen so far. You know, I think it already does it way better than the MCU's been handling the multiverse. And anything on like the CW shows tried to do. And it's a movie that's like has a ton of characters. Obviously, we see plenty more different iterations of Spider-Man, Spider-Girls, and Spider-Pigs and all and whatnot. But it's still somehow it's still filled with heart. You know, it's an emotional story. You really deeply care about these characters and the sort of plots and the sort of plot twists and the journey that we go on is really compelling. It makes for a unique cinematic experience because they can do things that you can't do in live action. And it's really like comic books come to life and like the first one was. And I think with this one, the stakes are even higher, and with it, you know, being part of a trilogy and ending on a cliffhanger, you know, it just leaves you wanting more. So I had a blast with this one, and you know, I thought about it a lot after watching it, and I still am now. So I can't say enough about how much I enjoyed this film.
What about you, Pat? What were your initial thoughts?
You know, I loved how it stayed true to form. You know, it was kind of the first movie was very much comics brought to life. And it was very integrated with the music. Like the music was very much part of the experience of the movie in a kind of a way that goes a little above and beyond typical movie cinematic like music or orchestral music, because they used a lot of more modern music and more modern beat schemes and modern ways of portraying the various things they want you to try and feel. Because that's what
I've been listening to the soundtrack like every day still.
Yeah,
it's a great soundtrack.
Yeah.
Shout out Metro Boomin.
That's what it's trying to do is to try and elicit feelings as you move through the scenes, right? You know, if you ever watch a suspense movie with like muted, they're almost funny, right? I remember watching a shark movie like The Meg or whatever with it muted, and I laughed a lot through that movie because it wasn't suspenseful anymore because the music wasn't there. You know, the roaring sound and then absence of sound that they can use to really draw you in. And I love that they kept that. Like it very much felt like you could get drawn into Miles through not just the visuals, but also the audio. And you could really put yourself into sort of his world via the way he heard his world. And I love the fact that we went, you know, they did another scene where basically you're listening to him, listening to music.
Sucker for the fourth wall stuff, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's right, yeah. And I thought it was very interesting, some of the music they played around with, some of the villain themes from the original that they moved on to different characters in this one that you realize, like the first time you see Spider-Man 2099, you get the villain music or kind of a variation on it. And I love the way they played with that through the movie. I don't know, maybe it was about a third, somewhere between a third and 2/3 of the movie. Like, it just slammed into me. I was like, this is really good. Beyond the spectacular visuals and the spectacular audio, like the movie itself was just really good. I can't tell you what exactly made me think that. It was just a switch that went off in my head. I was like, this is really good, and I'm going to have to watch this at least 3 to 4 more times to really get it all. But I loved it. I loved pretty much every minute of it.
And Mike, I don't think I asked you this before we were recording, but have you been a Spider-Man fan before these newer animated ones?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I kind of came of age for the Tobey Maguire trilogy. But, and then I remember probably even more so the cartoon as a kid, the television cartoon. Like the actual comics, it probably wasn't the comic that I read the most because they weren't really the comics that my dad had. And so from just the straight comics, I wasn't as, other than just the like kind of encyclopedia ones that you might find where it's just like everything Spider-Man, not necessarily like this issue, that issue, but you kind of just know a lot about the character. But then, yeah, like I said, I came of age more for the Tobey Maguire one. And then by the time the Andrew Garfield iteration, I just wasn't, pursuing it as heavily. I think I saw the first one. And then same thing with the Tom Holland and the MCU. It was more just because it was part of the MCU. It wasn't like specifically like, oh, it's Spider-Man now. So this one, I mean, it felt, and obviously it felt very different in general. Like even if you were a huge Spider-Man fan, the whole Miles Morales storyline or the Spider-Verse movie in terms of animation style and story and all that, it should have come off as very different anyway. Yeah, just with kind of my familiarity or background and that sort of thing, it just really struck me. But this is talking more about the first one back in 2018. But then, obviously continuing that story. So.
Yeah, and I know you recently wrote a piece for the Voyage blog about how they portray these kind of multiverse, this multiverse philosophy, like in general. I know you have thoughts on that.
Well, and I mean, really, it was convenient that it came out right before the Across the Spider-Verse movie, but it wasn't even necessarily directed at Across the Spider-Verse. It was just more what can sometimes be the underlying theme to a lot of multiverse storylines. And this goes across the board. This is whether we're talking, Doctor Strange, whether we're talking even like Rick and Morty and all the multiverse stuff that they do. And it creates this sort of air of insignificance to the individual because it's like, oh, well, you're just this small speck of dust in this huge universe. Well, all you're doing is making the universe bigger, which is supposed to kind of like imply that you're even more insignificant. And it's like, you're kind of missing the point still. So that was just one of the things that came up about it.
And I felt like they did kind of play with that in this movie, right? The idea, and I didn't say at the top of the episode, spoilers, everybody, if you have not seen this movie.
Oh yeah, I haven't said anything yet.
We're gonna spoil this movie, but like the fact that
I haven't seen part 2 yet, so I'm excited. I've heard good things. But...
Right, yes, from the future of part 2. But yeah, like 2099, tells Miles, you were never supposed to be Spider-Man. And that sort of idea of insignificance versus the significance of the individual, I think is definitely something they play with.
It's exponential to what the other Spider people were telling him in the first movie, right? Is like, you're not ready. You can't do this. You shouldn't be here, or you shouldn't be doing this. And so now it's like you're taking that same thing from Into the Spider-Verse and you're blowing it up to, a huge proportion.
Yeah. And two, it allows them to play that whole idea of insignificance. It allows them to play with kind of like ideas of fate and free will. Like, does the individual really have any agency? And they introduced an interesting concept in this movie that I should have seen coming. I don't know how I didn't. And that was canon events. That there are certain aspects of Spider-Man's story that seemingly apply to every iteration of Spider-Man and Spider-Woman. What did you guys think of that? Of the canon events idea, both as a storytelling device and just like a new idea for a Spider-Man story. I don't know if it's been done in the comics before, but this was the first time I encountered it.
Yeah, I mean,
where's the universe where there are no canon events? That's what I'm waiting for. Isn't that what should be coming up next? Right? The universe where there aren't canon, because if there's so many if it's such a multiverse, and I know I'm kind of playing off of the same thing that you're bringing up, right? Which is like, we're going to treat these things as so important, and yet you personally are so unimportant, even though you have this role to play in canon event X, Y, canon event X, canon event Y, canon event Z.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it's a cool device. I mean, obviously in like crossover event comics like Crisis on Infinite Earths or Flashpoint, yeah, there are certain like events that happen that sort of affect all the universes. And you see that in the MCU too, like with the TVA and how they're trying to keep everything in order.
Yeah.
That's pretty much Spider-Man 2099's role, and the Spider Society is making sure everything, happens as it should, right? And it's kind of it's a cool story device, and it kind of serves as like another villain. It's probably the major villain for Miles, because he's trying to break that mold. Like the cliffhanger at the end, before we get to the cliffhanger, the whole point is like he's trying to go make sure his dad doesn't die.
Right.
And he's trying to go against the, what should happen, against the canon event. And like you mentioned, like his whole existence, the whole reason for him being Spider-Man is because it went against the canon event. Like it was an event that wasn't supposed to happen. So he's kind of like been fighting this again, like you mentioned, since the first film, since Into the Spider-Verse. So it's something that, the villain is awesome in this movie. The Spot, right?
The Spot. Yeah.
The Spot. Yeah. Like he's a great villain. I mean, he's like a D-list villain in the comics, but like they heightened him, elevated him to like, visually.
And they make a
really
joke
cool
about that too. So it's the same kind of like fourth wall, like meta kind of storytelling.
Yeah. And it was very clever how they used sort of like power set and how he doesn't have a lot of screen time in the film, but his presence is really felt, and visually he kind of has his own thing going on, and it looks really cool. So I think him, coupled with the whole like Miles trying to sort of beat or overcome the Spider Society and these canon events, I think it's a really cool challenge for him, and it's sort of a unique way of incorporating this multiverse concept into the story. It's not just an excuse to meet all these different characters. It's actually something that is going against him. And I thought it was brilliant. And I don't know if you're like the canon event memes with Spider-Man 2099. If you're like on TikTok or social media, they've been hilarious. So,
okay, interesting.
So it's kind of taken a life on its own in like the TikTok world. And
they used to say that you need to, be well versed in literature so that you get the jokes that the culture makes. Well, now it's you need to be versed in movies so that you can get the jokes that social media makes.
Right.
You have to get all the Star Wars memes. You have to get all the canon event memes, whatever the new set of memes are.
Yeah. So yeah, it's that part has been fun too.
I thought what was super interesting to me was that Spider-Man 99, and I can't remember his name. So I'm terrible with names, but Miguel. He's not the one ultimately who is enforcing the canon event, right? Like the universe itself enforces it. Like we see that, both in his backstory he tells where, he tried to jump to another world, effectively live there as him who had died, and he just takes his place, and then the whole world gets like wiped out by itself, by the cosmos. And then we see that play out in was it Moonbatten with the Indian Spider-Man?
Oh yeah.
After the police chief gets saved, or the captain gets saved, and then the universe starts to eat itself, right? And the thing pops up, and they have to put those pylons down to stop it. And so he's not like, he is the bad guy, but also he's not the one. Like, he's not doing this. If it was up to him, right, he wouldn't have had that happen. He would have just lived his life with his daughter and just been happy, but the universe seems to be imposing this. And so I found that, like, even though he is sort of set up as like that villain for that, even though the Spot is the ultimate villain, but for that episode or for that movie, he's trying to stop something more terrible from happening. And when he says like, we're the good guys, and he says it like in a we're the bad guys kind of way, like, he's still not wrong. Like, he's still trying to save all of the people from that universe, because as far as he knows, like, if Miles pulls this off and saves his dad, it still wipes out their universe. Like, it's still a bad deal at the end of the day. And I thought that was an interesting idea of kind of like free will and fate. So there is sort of this fated system where the Spider-Man has to fall in line and have these experiences, and if he tries to fall out of line, then the fate monster will come along and destroy his universe. But he still has the free will to choose, right? It's not like a necessarily fated way in the same way fate plays out in a lot of fairy tales or a lot of stories with him.
Oedipus had the free will to choose too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the real bad guy in every myth? It's always fate is the real bad guy. You know, there's so many of the mythological stories too, and it's the same kind of similar pattern.
Yeah, definitely. And it to my mind, it calls to mind, like the Norse and, Goddardammerung, Ragnarok, the Twilight of the Gods, where it's like, it's inevitable. And from their perspective, for all the Aesir, the Norse gods know, nothing they do prevents it. And whenever they try to prevent it, they just make it happen faster. So I think there's definitely, they're playing on themes that are as old as mythology, just in a new way with our new mythological characters with superheroes. And it's interesting because I thought I was afraid that things weren't going to work, because I'm like, well, in my mind, Spider-Man is always like, well, he's friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and sometimes he teams up with the Avengers and it's great. But it's like, and not having read any of the Spider-Verse comics, I'm like, is this really going to work where they bring him into this multiverse, spider society where there's hundreds of thousands of Spider-Men, does that diminish him as friendly neighborhood Spider-Man? And I don't think so, because it's still Miles's story. You get to see him with his parents and his, the fellow students at the school he goes to and the people in his neighborhood. There's a lovely little moment when, remember when the Spot is robbing the ATM? And I love that Spider-Man is on a first name basis with the guy who runs the little general store.
Yeah. How much do I owe you for this?
How much do I owe you for this? And he's like, Spider-Man, it's free. Just get that guy. I like that he knows the people in his neighborhood. And clearly he's had to prevent this place from being robbed before. And he just has these relationships with people in the community. And I just they keep him. I think it's because he's grounded as a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man that he doesn't get swept away into this whole, oh my gosh, the Spider Society and all that. He can see their weaknesses in a way, or but he sees things which to them are blind spots. Well, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, and I think all that you mentioned, and also Gwen's story being highlighted in this, it really keeps the film grounded, because you see the story arc with her and her father, and then also between her and Miles. And I thought it was a good choice, having her sort of be the conduit, the through line to the whole Spider Society aspect, and how she has to struggle with well, do I let Miles know about this? Do I let him in? Do I disappear forever and leave him alone? That sort of all those emotional arcs and journeys that these characters go through keep the film really grounded, juxtaposed with all the fun stuff with the Spider Society and all the Easter eggs and then the epic sort of chase at the end. There's this emotional through line through all of it, and it's not just there for fanfare. Part of why I really enjoy the movie is because it's not just fan service. It's you're really invested in these characters, and that's really hard to do with animation too, especially we're not we're adults watching this, so it's gotta be elevated in a way to where we feel what these characters are feeling, and I thought they did as good as a job as you can. And you can see the relationships with that Miles has with his parents has evolved. It's the parents are dealing with the sorts of things that typical parents deal with kids that age, and it all feels relatable. It feels real. I think those sort of quieter scenes or street level scenes are what makes this movie sort of very Spider-Man-esque. Like you said, you have that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man feel to it, along with this whole big multiverse story that they're trying to tell. Yeah, I thought that they did as good as a job as you could, having to deal with all those sorts of juggling those aspects of that character.
Yeah, I thought it was a real strong opener, having Gwen's story basically be like the first 10 minutes before we even get like the title screen, right? Before we even get the Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. And then you see at the same time you have Miles' story going on, you also see Gwen's story evolve from that place where you see her go off to the Spider-Verse, and the relationship with her father and the interplay of like why she doesn't want to go back. It's not just simple, I don't want to deal with him from an emotional perspective, or I don't want to deal with the world from an emotional perspective. She's also terrified that she's going to have to watch him die because he's a police captain, and what happens to police captains is they die, and so she doesn't want to go back. And then like how that revolves into her finally like watching Miles interact with his parents and having things go just so terribly wrong within the Spider-Verse, and seeing Miguel for maybe being a little bit of a megalomaniac and witnessing Miles save the day for the other Spider-Man in Moubatten, and him getting to get the captain and the friend still being alive, and then reconsidering, well, maybe I can go back, and maybe I can, and having her actually go through that and us getting to witness it was interesting, because it meant we weren't just following Miles, but we were also following her through her own storyline. I think that was one of the things that made the movie really good to me, is we weren't just watching a single character's growth, who we had watched already grow quite a bit from the first film, and who we were watching sort of grow in this next film. We were also getting to watch Gwen grow, and her story kind of changed as it went. And I thought that was really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that in every, especially larger than life figure, when you're putting that character, that person into, whether it's a movie or a story of some kind, is you have to find that some sort of small connection. And so nobody connects with the multiverse, but they connect with Spider-Man. Or nobody connects with the Avengers, they connect with Tony Stark and Captain America. So, whether it's showing the familial relationships, or, I guess even though I was maybe sounded critical of the canon events and how much emphasis is placed on it, as a viewer, it is very convenient for us, because we can hear, somebody like Spider-Ham say something, and we know a lot of the backstory. So, and I'm actually thinking of the first movie, but when he says, like, we all have lost somebody, or the hardest part is knowing
you can't save everybody.
Yeah.
Because we know Spider-Man and we know the canon events, we can imagine that for Spider-Ham, for Spider-Man Noir, for Spider-Gwen, right? And then obviously the later movies, or they're kind of filling in the pieces a little bit. But that's kind of one of the convenient things for us, is we can already have that sort of built-in connection and say, whether it's this version or that version or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that. I know, Mike, in your notes that you sent me, you mentioned how, like, in this movie, we see a lot more of Miles' relationship with his mom, whereas in the first movie, it's very much an emphasis on him and his dad, rightly. But I like that we get that dynamics where we see how his parents work together as a couple and as parents, trying to raise this kid right, but also knowing that he's getting to that age where they kind of have to let him go a little bit and let him make mistakes, that they're not always going to have control over what happens. And I thought that the family scenes were some of the most effective, like emotionally too, in the whole movie. I thought that was great.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, not only is it because Miles is a little bit older and he's had a little bit more, like, or different experiences, but you can see how specifically the issues that are coming up in part 2, it's like it resonates more with his relationship with his mom, whereas a lot of that growing up, going out into this new experience or this new school, which was Into the Spider-Verse, you can see how that would resonate so much with his dad. And obviously they both had a part to play in both movies, but how there's much more of an emphasis on one and then the other.
Yeah, I definitely think too that oh yeah, and we got to see before I forget, we got to see Peter come back. He has a family now.
Oh yeah,
which is great.
So
that was so terrific,
awesome.
so terrific.
So awesome.
And Mayday, the fact that the kid is called Mayday, that reference to May, to Aunt May, and that she's like a little terror, so it's Mayday. It's just brilliant. Oh, that was just so heartwarming. I loved that they brought old characters back, but they also made room for some new additions to the cast. We had several.
A lot of toys to be sold, Thomas.
That's right. Yeah, a lot of
merchandising.
I sound cynical. That's
And it's like some of them, I like how some of them, like, I was sort of vaguely aware of because I've seen them on like comic book covers and stuff. Like Spider-Punk. I was aware of him before, but I didn't know that was his name. I'm just like, oh yeah, the Spider-Man with spikes on his at the top of his mask. But yeah, I like that they made room for new characters and how they hint at the end of the movie of getting the band back together from the first movie. I was like, yes, all right, let's go. Because, you know, you become attached to those characters, to Noir, to Spider-Ham, to Penny Parker. And so I'm glad that going forward, we're going to see more of them. This definitely did feel like a middle movie in a trilogy. And we were saying before we started recording that they may have pushed back the release date for the third movie.
I've only heard it as a rumor. That's all I can, you know, I don't have some sort of insight, and that's just what I've seen, rumblings or whatever.
Yeah, like it's still, I don't think they've officially said it's not coming out in March, but like all the reports are saying like, yeah, the movie's not even close to being done. So
well, and they also, it just occurred to me, they have to deal with the writer's strike.
That's moving everything.
And there are rumblings apparently of a Screen Actors Guild strike and all kinds of other stuff. So if that's in the air,
it could happen today.
You know, like to be safe, they're probably just like, don't expect it until later.
Yeah, I think that's very safe to say. But I mean, again, the quality of these films.
Take all the time you need.
Yeah, you gotta. Don't. We've seen what happens when movies get rushed to production, and I don't think they would do that with this one anyway.
No.
I mean,
yeah.
It's been 5 years since Into the Spider-Verse, so I think waiting a little extra time would be more than worth it.
And you can definitely tell, I don't know about you guys, but I felt that they took what they did in the first movie and what they learned in the first movie in terms of visuals and clocked all that up to 11.
Oh, big time.
With this movie. This is one of the most visually impressive movies that I've seen in a long time.
Yeah, I something that kept catching me because of how many panoramic views they did is that Miles is the central focus of definition. And you look at Miles and how he's drawn and the things in his direct vicinity, and everything has very clear lines and is very defined. And it's still a little sketchy and a little comic booky, but the further you get from Miles, the less clear and more fuzzy things get until you're like in those really big panoramic shots. I was actually having trouble because I thought my eyes weren't focusing correctly when I was trying to look at like the cityscape when they're upside down, looking at it all, because all of the buildings are almost like doubled up, lined on each other because they're so slightly off kilter. They're just, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier the further you get from Miles. And I thought that was like a super cool technique to get you to focus on, this is a really cool, awesome panoramic shot. But the important part is Miles and Gwen, or the important part is these two people doing something here. I noticed the spot also had, oddly enough, a lot of definition to him, but everything was drawn almost very clearly on him, especially when he had no spots. It was like, he was kind of like the blank slate, but he really was blank. In that sort of setting where you have all the little dots, you've zoomed in close enough, you have all the little dots making up the actual color. He doesn't have that going for him because he's just black and white, and you don't need the pixel dots necessarily to do that because it's just blank space or it's white space. So I thought that was a pretty cool use of, like you said, it's like they took what they learned from the first one and dialed it up to 11.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And it was also, again, like the first one, it felt the most like a comic book brought to life. And I feel like a lot of times when a superhero movie feels that way, it's often an animated one, simply because, like we've said before, you can do things in animation that you sometimes can't get away with in live action, either because the budget's not there or it just looks preposterous in live action, no matter.
I mean, Spider-Punk, he was a different frame rate than every other character.
Yes. Oh, was that what was up with him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was, and like he's constantly, like a typical punk rock, magazine or poster. It looked like he was just constructed of like different patches of like magazines. And,
I said to my, it was like the Sex Pistols. It looked like it was
Exactly.
like like you were seeing which I mean, again, punk rock, that totally makes sense. But
yeah.
So yeah, the way that it was sort of laid out like that is what it reminded me of.
Yeah, you couldn't do that in live action. Like like they would just look so weird if like you composited a character in a different frame rate. Like it would just look so, it wouldn't look good. I don't care how hard you try. So yeah, it's cool how like almost every character has their own aesthetic. Like, and like Gwen's, her Earth has its own sort of aesthetic. Is very like colorful, lots of like blues and pinks. It was, and like as the spot like evolved, like he sort of got like darker and like more scribbly and
right.
It's just like you said, there's stuff you can get away with in animation, and I feel like they use that to their advantage.
I think the Spot's an interesting character because he's one of those classic kind of supervillains where he thinks Spider-Man knows who he is and he thinks Spider-Man thinks his relationship with him is very important, as much as he thinks it's important. And then when he realizes that he's not the center of Spider-Man's attention, he gets so upset. And I thought that I've seen that done in other superhero cartoons before. And I've always thought that's kind of a funny trope where the villain thinks, well, of course you remember me. I was this guy in the background at the particle accelerator. And
Doofenshmirtz and Perry the Platypus and Phineas and Ferb. That's the thing. He doesn't realize that. Yeah.
That's it.
That he's overblowing the sense of grandeur is too big.
Doofenshmirtz Evil Incorporated. Sorry. A little jingle.
SQPN will have to start Secrets of Phineas and Ferb next. That'll be the next podcast.
All over that.
Don't cut this out.
No, yeah, exactly. Let's leave this in. But and it's interesting because almost like it was kind of confusing for me at first, where I'm like, so who is the villain of this piece? Because from the trailers, it makes you think it's 2099, and he clearly like he is an antagonist, but from his point of view, like we said before, he thinks he's saving the multiverse. He's almost like a Thanos type character in that way, where like
he's gonna have a redemptive arc in part 3 or across. Like he's gonna have to have his like, you guys were talking about how in part 1 we kind of have that like intro for Miles, and part 2 is that intro for Gwen. I'm almost wondering if part 3 is gonna have that intro for Miguel. And you're going to get to see him, losing his daughter, trying to join that new world and have his cake and eat it too. And then that world imploding or whatever is going to happen. And so you get sort of a little bit more filled out to his motivations. And not that you're going to like side with him, but there's going to be some sort of convergence, right? Where there's going to be some make or break moment and he's going to, join the good guys, so to speak, or do the right thing like I said, it seems like it's fitting that it would do something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like almost like I mentioned earlier, like the villain is like sort of it's time. It's the multiverse itself. It's these canon events, right? He's all working against him. It's funny, the Flash that just came out, it was sort of the same thing. There wasn't like a clear villain in the film. Like you see Zod in the trailers and stuff, but Zod's really not the ultimate villain in that movie. We're gonna have a conversation about that film maybe on another episode.
Right.
But it's sort of the same thing. It's like really what Barry's fighting in that film and what Miles is fighting in this film is time. And he's when we get to the end of the movie, he's trying to get to the right Earth. He ends up on the wrong one. This kind of goes
with the whole deconstructionist storytelling that is part of every superhero movie now. Is you can't just have a straight up bad guy. The bad guy has to be, like you said, fate or time, or it has to be some sort of more systematic, like bigger impersonal force.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I'm going to fight, I'm going to fight Zod. I'm going to fight Thanos. I'm going to fight whoever. And so it's like, it's very, it kind of fits with that whole, just that's how we have to understand superheroes now, right? It's not satisfying or it's not interesting enough for Superman to just fight Zod or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, because we've seen it before. Yeah. We've seen Spider-Man fight Green Goblin. We've seen the Justice League try to defeat Darkseid. Like we've seen it in other animated films and live action films, like the sort of origin stories or like the A-list sort of villains. So now like comic book movies are at a point where they want to tell these sort of grander, big event type films where like in the comics where they're big, huge crossover events, kind of hard to maybe when you're reading the comics maybe 10 years ago, before like we've had all these big crossover events in films. Maybe you're like, oh, how could you make this into a movie? It would be so hard. But, I think these writers and directors and all the creative minds that work on these films, they're just doing such a great job adapting these sort of stories to film. And it's not always successful, but in this case, with these Spider-Verse films, they're doing a heck of a job. And I think it's really paying off, because I think if they just did the run of the mill, like Miles is gonna fight his version of Green Goblin and his version of Doc Ock, like, I'm sure the movies would be fine, but this sort of elevates it to something we've literally never seen before visually and from a story standpoint.
Do you think audiences will get weary of the multiverse eventually?
I think they have. I think they already have.
We're there already.
I think they're already there.
In this version, we have.
In this timeline, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
In this timeline, we're
well, you see,
there might be one where it can go on infinitely, but
yeah, I mean, with the Flash, like it totally bombed, and I know there are other factors that went into that, but I think in the state of where DC's at, which we discussed in a previous podcast, they're going in a totally different direction, and the Flash is kind of like a child of the past. It's sort of like it's from the old DCEU, which is, I guess, which is over now, and it is telling and it's trying to do the Flash. It's trying to tell this Flashpoint story in its own way, and people just didn't go see it. And then you see the state of Marvel. There's other factors that go into too, but they're trying to tell this whole multiverse story, but it seems like they're trying to figure it out as they go along. It's not like they had this grand plan, like, I guess with the Infinity Saga, where it was kind of mapped out for the most part. Like Kevin Feige had the idea of where we're going to end up. And it seems like, with all these like Disney Plus shows and trying to, with the movies put in there and then trying to react to, oh, maybe audiences don't like this, so maybe we should change things. I think audiences are getting sort of tired of this whole multiverse thing, because it's like, okay, well, do I have to watch this show in order to know what's going to happen in this film? And that, like, I'm not really into this show. Is it okay if I skip it? Like, I think that sort of aspect of it can challenge audiences. But I think when we're just talking about this Into the Spider-Verse trilogy, it's all contained. Yeah. So it's not like you have to watch other things to get what's happening in these films. So I think that has it going for itself. It's not like this big, like...
But you have to see the Tom Holland one to get the Donald Glover joke, though. So it's like...
That's true. Yeah. It's fine if you get an Easter egg.
Everything, everywhere, all at once to get that one joke.
And you have to see that one episode of Community where he wears Spider-Man pajamas to get the whole
God, right.
falls apart.
Yes, nice. That's cool.
Well, Tom, this goes back to one of our first points where we were talking about like the whole, like, again, my issue with the multiverse isn't the multiverse per se. It's more that it undermines the value of the individual person. And in this case, what you're asking about when you say multiverse fatigue is it's that same question, but projected onto stories in general, right? So like you're saying that when the multiverse gets so big, it starts to make these individual stories matter less. And so people are asking, do I need to watch this one and this one and this one just to get this other one? And so it's making all the smaller stories matter less. You don't get as invested because you don't see how they all fit together into this big plan. And it goes back to actually the people were asking the same question, not about the multiverse, but about superhero movies. They're saying, are we getting superhero movie fatigue? And this goes back to, we had the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, we had the Christopher Nolan Batman. We were just kind of starting to lean into the Iron Man and then what we now know as the MCU Phase 1, Phase 2, and all that stuff. It wasn't that we were getting sick of superhero movies. It was that they all just were these disconnected little bits. We wanted a big, grand, overarching story. And now we got that with the whole, Endgame,
right,
like saga. And everybody's been trying to copy that. But, Marvel was left with where do we go from here? And we just have to make it bigger. But now you can't bring all those back into one overarching story again. And so it makes them all matter less. And it's the same thing. Like I said, that's the same problem that multiverses have with all of us individually is, well, if there's just 500 billion other versions of me, then do I even matter in the first place? Or does my story even matter? And that's the problem with it is, again, not that that's actually true that we don't matter, but it presents that as if that's the case, right? It creates this sort of like nihilism about my own existence.
And Miles definitely has to confront that head on, right? Because before I forget, he meets at the end of the movie an evil version of himself, Miles as Prowler, which, again, how I didn't see that coming, I'm not sure. But
because you're just so awestruck by the visuals that you can't.
Right, it like left hooked me hard. I did not see that coming at all, and I was like, oh.
Well, just the fact that it would take him to this other universe, right? That it would take him to the universe where the spider was
right,
from, where he was
yeah.
from. I mean, that was.
But see, what I really love about that was that it kind of takes that notion that you don't matter as part of this, since you're no longer part of just a single universe, you're part of a multi-universe. The fact that in the Spider-Verse, or what did Miguel call it? It was like the multi-universal connected, and Miles is just like, Spider-Verse is better. Yeah. But it takes that and says, no, they're all connected somehow. And Miguel has this theory that if you don't follow the canon events in enough places, that it all falls apart. And Miles gets to see firsthand how much him becoming Spider-Man, or the existence of Spider-Man or not in a multiverse, has on all of the other people around him, and how much like what he does matter at the same time as being thrown in. So I liked how it played with that via the canon events. It was sort of like, these are the connecting things, and if they don't play out, it doesn't just affect this universe, it could repercuss to the rest of them, which is exactly what's going on with the whole Miles problem, right? Because he gets bit by a spider from another universe because there was a collider, and now he has a villain that literally spent a good 5 minutes universe hopping in what was just an amazing montage of like self discovery on the part of the Spot. Yeah. Talking to people as he's going around. And
so sorry that my brain had to go in this direction, but we think about the Last Judgment and how we're going to see the consequences of our actions, good and bad, and how they played out in God's plan. Think of how much longer that's going to take now that you're not only thinking about the consequences of your actions in this timeline, but in every timeline, right? So think of all the ripple effects, and that's going to be a very long Last Judgment if you think about all that you're going to be standing in line waiting for. Okay, so this is how my action affected in universe 162. This is how it affected in 573.
It is becoming Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World now.
Yeah.
Nice plug.
No, yeah.
So
Tell him to call me.
So it turns out because you prayed for yourself in all other multiverses, it actually helped Patrick in Universe 59B
That's what we call the body of Christ, man. It's all connected.
So did you guys have any other general thoughts, things that we didn't touch on yet before we wrap up?
Does the Tyrannosaurus Rex Spider-Man have to be a photographer?
Oh my gosh. That was so amazing.
Oh dear.
Does it have to hold the camera, and how does it have a very long, like, it's like a periscope for where you can see, the lens? Like it has to
is his Earth like still prehistoric? Like, do they even have cameras?
And if he's the Tyrannosaurus Rex, then who's J. Jonah Jameson in that universe? Because how is he going to talk to a T-Rex? Unless
so you're asking all the right questions.
Yeah, I'm wondering how big is the spider from that universe, and how did it get radioactive? like what had to happen to get this to play out?
That clearly had something to do with the comet, right? But
yeah.
Maybe that's where the venom came from. That's like the venom of that universe. It had to come from that comet,
That's amazing.
So much potential for spin-offs here.
Yeah.
Well, in the first one, it was like the deleted scenes or whatever, where Spider-Ham kind of goes and has his little episode. I don't know if you guys saw in Into the Spider-Verse. So they could do that. Yeah, they could do that a 1,000 different times. Have a little 7-minute clip of each of these Spider-Men going back into their perspective universes, and the therapist Spider-Man does he just do photography as a hobby and not as a job because he's already a therapist? So it's like,
well, let me guess. He died. Boom! And all the Spider-Mans rushed into his office.
Oh man.
Seems a little insensitive.
I know, right? It's like, that's not exactly being a good therapist there, is it?
But it's supposedly it's a version of Peter being a therapist, so I don't think Peter would make a good therapist anyway.
You're too many quibs. You're too many quibs to be a to be a therapist.
Right.
Yeah, unprofessional to make all those jokes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was, what I was thinking about with this film at the end of it. Well, first of all, I felt like this is, like you mentioned earlier, it's definitely a middle movie, and it reminded me of like Empire Strikes Back, where it ends on a cliffhanger, but it's still very satisfying, like as a standalone. Like that's the majority of Star Wars fans, name that one as the best. And who knows, this film might end up being the best of this trilogy. That's yet to be seen. But yeah, this movie, like as it stands alone, is incredible. And we've been singing its praises, for almost an hour now. But what I think this movie ultimately, what it's trying to do is, like with the first film, it was like, okay, it's the typical like Spider-Man, like, oh, we've gone through all these losses. Like Miles sort of connects with the other characters in the first one because they have these sort of shared experiences, suffering losses, and that's sort of like Spider-Man's, at least Peter Parker's, and obviously Miles has to share that in a sense. It's like Spider-Man always gets screwed in the end. Like he, no matter how hard Spider-Man tries, he's gonna lose loved ones. He always loses his uncle, and Aunt May dies in some of the comics and in the movie. Like it just happens to Spider-Man. It's sort of inevitable for that character. And in this film, they're trying to push against that. It's like, can Miles overcome the typical Spider-Man defeat? Can he overcome this canon event of his dad dying? And what happens when the canon is broken? Like, who do you become? What kind of person does that make you? Like Miles would have never became Spider-Man if that. When that spider never entered his universe, and like that was supposed to happen, right? It wasn't supposed to happen, right? So the movie's asking all these like great questions. It's like, well, what if these things don't happen? Or like, what if these like sort of tragedies don't happen and these canon events don't happen? Who do you become? What happens outside of like every universe collapsing? Like if these certain canon events have happened and the universe has stayed intact, for the most part, all the different universes, like, well, how far can we take this, and can we defeat fate and time and all that? So I think it's, again, another elevation of the story and of a Spider-Man arc that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, and I definitely have high hopes for part 3. I'm very invested in these characters. I want to see where this all ends. And it's like, I feel like this is kind of like, in a way, this series is kind of filling that emotional big superhero hook that the MCU used to do in Infinity, but is struggling with now. I think they need to kind of rediscover what it's really the characters that hook audiences. And you can kind of try and craft some big overarching story, but if people don't care about the characters, then it's not going to work.
Yeah, I have a sneaking suspicion that this is ultimately all really about Miguel. And this is Miguel's redemption arc is what we're seeing. And I love the comparison to Star Wars, because you have the first film very much as, Luke / Miles' coming of age / coming into a power and learning it and becoming part of a bigger world. And then you have the introduction of this villainous character who obviously still has good in him, Vader. And you get the same kind of feel with Miguel. And I think a lot of the effects of the multiverse that we see, the sort of destruction of the multiverse if the canon events don't go correctly, kind of tracks back to Miguel universe hopping. Right, because what we're seeing in the first film and in the second film are the results of somebody in Miles's universe screwing with getting from a multiverse to a multiverse. And in this case, it was Kingpin, right? But we don't know how Miguel did it and what kind of problems he caused around the multiverse. And I have a sneaking suspicion his redemption arc that we're going to catch get the full-fledged of in the third movie is going to involve him coming to terms with the problems and maybe fixing the problems that he caused when he jumped universes.
Well, that's the thing is like, for how fickle implementing a multiverse can be, there has to be, at least in Spider-Verse storyline,
Yes.
where did the canon events come from? There had to have been, whether you want to call it the divine Spider-Verse mind or whatever. Maybe it's Madam Web who's got the, behind all of this. But it's like those canon events had to have come from somewhere in order for somebody to have betrayed them, right? Whether it's Miguel or Miles or whoever it happened to be. And so that's what we need to, dig a little bit deeper, right? It's about going deeper into where did these spring up from, or who imposed these in the first place. Not that it has to be an imposition, right? Because God willing, they're all going to discover that it's just providence in the end. Maybe there's a Boethius version of Spider-Man who, maybe has like the consolation philosophy, who is going to show them the actual truth to all of it. But, anyway, it had to have come from somewhere, right? You can't just keep going infinite, like literally infinite universes.
Turtles all the way down.
Spiders all the way down.
Spiders all the way down.
Did they make that joke in the movie, or am I misremembering that? Spiders all the way down. I may have made that up.
Yeah. That joke gets made, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't think
because I was trying to remember. Am I? Yeah.
We'll save it for part 3. We'll save it for part 3.
Well, until part 3, we'd like to take a moment here at Coffee and Comics to thank our patrons who make all our shows at StarQuest possible. And today, in particular, we'd like to thank James B., Father John E., Priscilla H., Darius M., and Gary H. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give help us to create the secrets of movies and TV shows and all the shows here at StarQuest. And we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What did you think of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse? You can let us know on our Facebook page or on Twitter. You can send an email to secrets@sqpn.com, or you can visit our channel on the StarQuest Discord server at sqpn.com/discord. And I can't keep plugging the Discord enough on these shows. I have a lot of fun there, and there's all kinds of awesome conversations going on. So check it out at sqpn.com/discord. Until next time, Andrew Hermiz, thank you for joining me in the secrets of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And Pat Mason, thank you as well.
All right, you're very welcome. As always, it's great being here.
And Mike Schramm, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Once again, I'm Thomas Salerno, and thank you for listening to Coffee and Comics, part of the secrets of movies and TV shows here on StarQuest.
There's another show on the StarQuest network you're sure to enjoy, The Catholics of Oz. Find it wherever fine podcasts are found, or at sqpn.com/Oz.